Chapter 3. The desert went on. For more than a week, we saw no water. I ordered my men to reserve what little rations we had, and I told them they could eat every third day. Their voices strained as they spoke with each other. Even Bernardo seemed hesitant to say anything. Instead, he huddled with his wife in their carriage. Days passed. No events had occurred. Marcos repeated his story to the men, and the men tried their best to believe.
Cibola, he said. Cibola is the first city.
Yes, Cibola, Francisco, but how far?
Further than this. Have faith, my son.
The land became drier. Cracks of hot, white sand stretched for miles at a time. Towards the east, we saw a line of mountain ridges. But the further we traveled, the further and further those mountains seemed to move away. This flummoxed us, and when asked by the men the reason for it, I simply replied, "The sun plays tricks." We marched further north. 2 more days passed, but all was the same. Seeing that the men were tired, I ordered them to refrain from marching at midday. We rested, then started again 2 hours later. At that time, I studied the rocks. They seemed different from what I had been used to. They seemed red and misplaced. The boulders were denser and gray. I heard a roll of gusts shriek from time to time, shifting from west to east. But the land remained dead and empty. The view from the valley changed to wide spaces of sand and dust, and the mountains that were once cumbersome and beautiful were now starting to bleed and blend with every ray of the sun. I found myself alone one evening near a stretch of heavy sand that came up to my knees. I stayed for several hours, and I looked back at the land we had trekked. And before the sun descended, I had one single thought. The thought of impossibility. The word itself seemed to capture everything. It seemed impossible that we hadn't found the cities yet, but it also seemed impossible that we had gone so far. The land itself seemed impossible too. I studied the rocks once more and the endless stretches of sand and stone, and I thought about how they got here. Then I saw a queer light in the sky. It was a pale orange and silver light, and it disappeared suddenly. And for the longest time, I thought it was a fallen star. But again, the light reappeared and stayed. And from the light, something else appeared. It flickered and flashed, and I walked to get a closer look. I saw a tall, bare-chested native. At first I thought it was a guide, but as I looked closer, I knew it wasn't. His posture was unlike any being I had ever seen. He stood like a statue, and he wore a headdress much like an Arab's, made of coon skin. The Indian's face came into view, but he did not approach. He had brown skin and yellow eyes, small teeth, and a scar on his cheek. I drew my sword, but he did not flinch. Instead, he smiled brightly like a child. Then he laughed. And as he did, his laugh grew louder and deeper, and it boomed and echoed. And as the Indian squatted, he disappeared into the light, and a cloud of building smoke swirled and floated over me. I stood motionless. It felt like an eternity had passed. Then my men came to my side. "Senor! Senor!" "What? Is anything wrong?" "Wrong? You have been staring for quite a while." "I have." "Yes, for quite a while." I looked at them all and asked them if they had seen the Indian. They looked at me strangely and said they did not. I stayed close by the fire, and the night passed. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and the pain lingered. More hours passed, and all throughout the night, all I thought about was that tall, smiling Indian. I knew my mind was capable of playing tricks, and I knew for sure that the moment would stay with me. We came upon a canyon. At noon, the shadows came in black and thick, and stretches of dancing, swirling shadows covered the land. The land ahead was Arizuma land. It was red and brown and dense. I heard from my men that a dozen guides had found tiny pieces of silver. They said that there was a mine of some sorts among the slopes and widening red hills. That report alone sparked my men's interest, but when we got there, we found no metal of any kind. And the next days were sparse of words and void of food. At night, the men unleashed their dogs, and an hour later, the dogs returned with rats in their mouths. We took the rats to a flame and ate them slowly. My piece had dropped to the sand. It tasted rank, tough, and awful, but it was enough, at least for that night. As the night continued, I saw the dogs gather by a pit of rock and grass. They barked and slobbered. Then I saw one rat scurry and escape through a crevice of gray rock. The dogs then sniffed and stalked the pit and guarded all ends of escape. And just when I was about to return to the fire, I saw the rat burst through the opening. The dogs dashed and ripped and tore the rat apart, making it squeal and squeak until it died. And Julio and the other man watched and grinned. As morning came, we rested along a stretch of boulders and flowering cacti. We sliced the cacti and pierced and slurped what little water we could. Then I heard a shriek. It came west below the valley. About 5 minutes later, I caught up with Cardenas and asked his men if they had heard the sound. They all denied it. My men confirmed that they heard the shriek again, this time south of the hills. The sun rose higher. I watched the land from west to east. Then, in the distance, I saw a figure rush up a hill at a slanted, awkward pace. Then I heard the shriek again. It was louder than before. It sounded like a cry of a child. It continued and came in spurts and echoed. Then the figure came in clear. It was Marcos. His entire body trembled. He screamed so hard that he cracked his voice. Then he whispered and moaned. Tears ran down his face. Then he tripped and bled from his forehead to his chin. Cardenas and a few of his men came soon after. Cardenas turned to me. He asked Marcos the questions, and Marcos answered and affirmed. The men huddled together. All I heard were whispers. "We're here?" "Sure hope so." "No, that's impossible." "But it is. The friar said so." "He did?" "Christ in heaven. We're here!" The captains gathered. Coronado came to Marcos' side and clutched and embraced him by the shoulder. The captains stared long and hard at both of them. Then Marcos shouted and repeated his words in ecstatic and incredulous shrills. He babbled for several minutes. Some of it was in Latin, some in Spanish. "Are you sure, Marcos?" said Coronado. "I am certain, Governor," said Marcos. He pointed south. "Down the quarry. The cities are there." By then, all units had received word. My men's eyes lit up. Their pupils dilated. Marcos pointed south, and we followed him west towards the waning sun. Through a canyon, we found a narrow pass. I ordered my men to follow it down. Soon all divisions descended the slope. We came to the quarry and found a cave. The cave seemed small. Inside, it felt dank and humid. Several men entered with torches and found several rocks beneath the cave walls. They brought back the rocks to the surface, and we examined them, but there was not enough light to give a proper diagnosis. It would have to wait until morning. I watched my men sit near the fires as they wondered, prayed, and calculated. During the night, Bernardo sat by my side and whispered 1,000 questions. I answered none of them. I remember the caves in Peru very clearly, and as I told Bernardo about the caves, I was taken back for a moment. These caves glimmered in the same way, but I remember that the gold was buried well beyond the entrance. I wanted to believe. I truly did, and I hoped and prayed history would repeat. But it didn't. In the morning, we examined the rocks, but none of them contained silver or gold. They were mere mudstones. They were soft and of no value. We went back to the cave and dug and crawled for about an hour. 2 of the men discovered a pile of rocks about 20 feet in length. The pile shimmered from a distance. It shone brightly, and for a while we thought it was copper. But it wasn't. It was pyrite. It was soft and worthless. Coronado gave his orders, and as the sun blazed on, half of the men went north, the other half went east. We searched for the rest of the caves of the quarry. We searched the entire day, but each and every search was fruitless. There was no gold, no silver, nor any metal of any kind. There was only sand and stone. Many of my men shouted at the guides and gave them endless glares. The guides talked with the translators, and I could tell by their faces and their expressions that both parties were terribly confused about the demands, and most likely they were trying to find another person to cast blame upon. The fear that we put them in the day after Santaniello died was a permanent one. From that day on, they acted in haste and apologized at every turn. Dusk arrived, and all we did that night was curse and swear. The next day came, and Coronado ordered us to leave the canyon and head off east. My men languished on. Their faces were dirty and ragged. I knew they needed rest of some sort, but they knew all too well I couldn't grant them any. They looked half dead, but they carried on and trekked the entire morning. In their eyes I could see their qualms, their rage, and their hate. They hated the heat. They hated the long, ungodly, unforgiven days of nothing gained. They hated that the water that they had stored in their canteens was getting less and less, and they hated this endless desert. But most of all, their hatred lied within one main source: Marcos. That bald, fat piece of shit of a priest, as they called him, was a term that even I felt well deserved. Marcos, though a man of God, was still a man. He was fallible and ripe for ridicule. After the wasted day in the quarry, the men glared at him and showed him complete disdain each and every second they could. Coronado himself said not a word to him for several days. Although Marcos pleaded and cried that he was mistaken, his cries brought no empathy. I myself only gave Marcos one good glare a day, and I made sure it counted. Some men, though, made more of an impression. Some slammed into Marcos, kicking their knees into his legs as they passed by, and later knocking him to the ground, claiming each time they did so accidentally. Others took their frustration more bluntly and struck Marcos's mule with heavy sticks. The men were eventually caught and given 24 lashes each. Marcos's only saving grace, Brother Luis, dutifully came to his side. I stared at the two and eavesdropped on their conversation. I saw Marcos grab Luis' arm and point back to the mountain. But Brother Luis, too, was only a man. He could tolerate only so much.
Luis, the hills. Don't you remember? We've seen these hills. The cities are near. They must be.
But Luis did not respond. His face remained blank. And when there was truly nothing left to say, Luis departed. As we set up our tents, I paid close attention to Marcos. As usual, he was alone, but still, he remained the focus of everyone's attention. The rage was just at its beginning. Glares from every side fixed upon his bald forehead, and I seriously wondered if he would survive the night. More days passed. I forgot how many, and in truth, I very much wanted to forget. We traveled far beyond the desert hills and canyons, and the land became flat. Yet in the heat, it was still difficult to breathe. Many men took off their armor. They reverted to lighter quilted garbs that they either traded with or stole from the slaves and guides. But my armor remained on, for each captain was obliged to wear it at all times. At the end of one day, I saw Brother Luis sitting alone. He prayed the rosary by a small fire. I waited for a half hour and walked along the camp. I consulted with Castaneda briefly. When my discussion ended, I saw Luis again at the very same spot. But now he was staring amongst a small flame, and as I looked on, I thought it time to talk to him. My previous conversations with Luis were brief and admirable, but still, I did not know the man, and I wanted to dearly. I approached and sat beside him. He gave a warm smile, which I returned. We didn't say a word to each other for half a minute. We just stared into the flame. I thought it best if he had the first word. Then I remembered I was speaking to a monk. I might have waited 20 years for that to happen. I thought of what to say and what matter and order I would say them in, but they all felt too cliché and probing. Any further hesitation, and I knew that Luis would drift off into deep silence, or, heaven forbid, a prayer. The only thing that I thought would work was to ask him questions. They had to be true and correctly timed, and so I asked them. But, to my dismay, he gave perturbing, enigmatic answers. And, like many of our conversations, this one started out philosophically and ended emotionally and generally pointless. I stared at the brown mountain and moss-covered rocks. Then I turned my view to the silver rolling and tumbling clouds. The obvious seemed good enough. Looks like a storm. Yes, said Luis. This place needs water more than most. Does any of this land look at all familiar, Luis? All of it, sir, he said. All of it. Why are you still here, Luis? I came to save the souls of mankind. Is that all? I smiled. Luis did not. He looked at the land and sky. He breathed in and out with heavy sighs. Then he looked to the ground again. It's getting harder and harder to show the light. My faith has been tested so many times. Marcos makes it worse. The man is a good monk, I said. But as for a guide, he's as terrible as they come. Do you believe they would have killed him today? Said Luis. The men? Yes, the men. Yes, they would have killed him, had they had the chance. Why do you say so? I've seen the worst of men. Explain, Sardina. I have seen what happens when men's hopes are not granted. Men need proof. Do you always see the worst of men, Sardina? Most of the time. Why is that? That's the business I chose. We stared into the fire. Then I glanced at Luis's sad face. He looked like a lamb, waiting for his mother to return from the slaughter shed. He looked lost and frightened. Why do you look so pained? I asked. I'm trying to remember. What are you trying to remember? I'm sorry. I guess I'm trying to forget. Sorry, Sardina. I have a hard time with words. And memory. Memory is a funny thing. Then what are you trying to forget? I said. Again, Luis fell back to silence. I did too. I knew there was too much on his mind. So I repeated the question. What are you trying to remember, Luis? When the time comes, I'll talk about it. But not now, Sardina. I wanted to pry more. I wanted to ask him about the cities, their elevation, and their population. But I didn't ask him about any of those things. I loved him like a brother, but I knew I was still talking to a monk. I knew he was asked about these things many times before. I knew he was tired of stating the same outrageous claims that were repeated and perfected by Marcos. And I knew Luis's version of what he saw in the city was a true and solemn one, for I myself saw those things in Peru. And once you've seen a golden city like Cusco, you've seen them all. You need no assurance or other confirmation. What do you remember about this land, Luis? There's a valley not far away. Is there water in that valley? There's plenty of water. What else do you remember, Luis? The corazones. The corazones? Yes, they were the people of the valley. Were they peaceful? Yes. They were the kindest, most loving people I've ever met. They were all heart. That's why we named them so. Luis smiled and looked up to the sky. Are they close? They're close. It might take another day. The winds picked up, and the small flames of the fire settled to smoke. I watched the gray sky dim to black, and Luis closed his eyes and returned to prayer. Then I stood up and left him alone. We saw the mountains from the north fold down the back stretch of the sky. After 5 more miles, we came to another valley. and it was there we met the Corazons. I watched Coronado stand by Marcos as the people of the valley came out from their dwellings. When Marcos approached them, the tribe looked very confused. Most of them were thin and diminutive. The translators claim that they had no previous knowledge of Marcos at all. Marcos pleaded with them and rambled, stating that they've welcomed him before, but still, the tribe stood confused and were revolted by the sight of him. After the initial greeting, the interpreters were sent forward. Then Castañeda and Coronado dismounted from their horses and approached the head chieftain. It wasn't until Brother Luis had entered that the tribe let go of their stare. He made his way towards the fire and uncovered his hood. And, like Christ, Luis held his arms high and stood erect. The entire tribe all rushed to embrace him. They smiled and laughed, and they welcomed him with a great cordial embrace. And as the day progressed, the Corazons continued to treat Luis as if he were an old, lost friend. I looked back at Marcos and saw him gaze off into the distance with his shoulders slumped. His grave face had brooded. More translators came over, and afterwards, Brother Luis told the translators that we were an extension of his family and were to be treated as such. And the Corazons looked at us with a certain, sudden reverence. Coronado then approached, and the Corazons bowed in subservient, humble fashion, to which Coronado gracefully accepted. The welcoming commenced, and Luis initiated a prayer of solidarity. "They're all heart," I heard him say. "It's as if they knew Christ before we did. They don't need to be taught." With the sunlight fading, we set up camp in the valley, and the Corazons helped us gather wood and water. When night came, they approached us with gifts. Gifts of food and jewelry, gifts of stone, gifts of song and dance. The Corazons did not understand us, and we barely understood them. Nevertheless, the Corazons prepared the night's meal and shared it with us, and we feasted on beans and corn. And, just as Luis said, these people were the most pleasant tribe one could possibly imagine. They stayed quiet and observant, and they smiled and shared their land with us in true and humble dignity. In the span of 3 days, we rested and ate meals with the Corazons. They mostly ate beans and corn, but on occasion, we were fed the hearts of lizards and birds. Many of us were taken back by the serenity of the tribe. The Corazons reminded me very much of the Incas in the way they prayed. They knew their gods, and they took every moment to be with them. They sat with no expectation. Before and after each meal, they danced and prayed and smiled. They walked with grace and energy, but most of all, they made us feel truly welcomed. They were warm and humble. There wasn't any angst among them. They were farmers. They knew their crops, and they worked when they needed to. And they took each day as a blessing. During our stay, there were several peaceful days, but there was one day that I always remember, for on that day, I had simply stopped thinking. I don't know how it happened, but I did. For a great hour, there was not the past or the future. There was only the now, and I had not a single thought in my mind. I fished with the Corazons in the thinning creeks. I caught fish with my bare hands, and I smiled back at the Corazons every chance that I could. I didn't talk to my men, nor anyone for that matter. I just watched the water ebb and flow and saw the sunset upon the land. I stood on a cold slab of rock and ate sweet small berries I had found beside the bend in the stream. I lost all sense of my dreams and ambitions, and a great relief had followed. And for that great hour, it seemed as if my soul had left my body. It was an acceptance that I could only explain to myself. It was true and beautiful, but only made sense to me. It might have been my quiet talk with God. It might have been more. But at that moment, when the thinking stopped, the clarity of everything came to me. I didn't gaze out in the distance. I didn't wonder or scheme or fret. I merely touched the water and let the coolness settle to my hands. And in the stream, I saw my reflection. But more than that, I saw myself away from myself. And what I saw was a sad and forgotten soul whose whole life was driven by fear. And the fear remained in him. The fear of the inevitable. The fear that I would die and no one would know or care. But at that moment, I let go of the fear. And as the silence and beauty overtook me, I fell into a great content. But alas, that marvelous day had ended, and the next morning I returned to my senses. I stared at the stream and the fish below. I tried desperately to recapture that feeling, that moment where everything was clear and beautiful, but it was too late. And like a dream, I barely remembered it. Then the moment passed, and my thoughts returned. My men asked me for their orders. Their language and the spoken word jolted me back to my consciousness. They looked at me strange, but I had managed to give them their orders, and they nodded and performed them. As dusk settled over, night had followed. I looked for Luis. I wanted to talk to him about the moment and console him. I searched throughout the camp, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Instead, I found another priest who sat by a dozen of the corazones by a pile of white stones. The priest instructed the translators who sat by their side. I pardoned myself and asked if he had seen Brother Luis, but the priest simply ignored me and continued with the lesson. He showed the Bible to one of the corazones with wide and prideful eyes. Then he raised it over his head and said, "Words from this book will show the way." I watched the corazones sit perplexed and stare at the book with deep skepticism. They looked as baffled as I did. I searched for another half hour and found Luis sitting by a stone wall. But by that time, I no longer wanted to talk. His face seemed tired. I nodded back to him and departed. He merely waved his hand slightly away from his knee and returned to prayer. I made my way towards my men and studied their faces. They had their share of the corazone's hospitality, and I knew they could no longer even feign interest. They were tired of waiting, tired of eating, tired of watching the corazones dance and smile, tired of the frustration and rejection, and I knew all they wanted to do was leave this place immediately and find the cities, and I heard their questions in my mind. The cities, the gold, where are they, Captain Sardina? But they didn't ask the questions. They sat and stared and looked at me, and all I could do was pat each of them on the shoulder. Later in the evening, I came across Cardenas, who was drunk and alone. He stood by his fire and swung his sword and shouted incoherently in the dark. I found him an hour later, still in the same place. I walked up and checked his pulse. He was still alive, but he remained in a horrible, sad stupor. He lay on his side and rambled. "We should have killed these people when we had the chance. We should have killed them all." "These people saved us," I said to him. "They have no gold, no silver. They have no spices. They have nothing. They are nothing. They are a waste of our time." I gave Cardenas a long and forceful glare, but he dismissed me and turned away. I got back to my feet and departed, and when I turned my head, I watched Cardenas sink his face back into the sand. In the morning, I spotted Luis and Marcos with the translators and the corazones. The lesson went on for 2 hours, as Marcos taught them the sacred and holy Trinity. He started with God the Father. Then he preached about God the Son. The corazones seemed perplexed about all these gods. But when Marcos finally spoke of the all-powerful, all-knowing Holy Ghost, they seemed to confirm and understand. After the lesson, Marcos was approached by 2 of the captains. They asked him one question, and they repeated it several times. The cities, Marcos. Where are they?" "They're close. Believe me, they are. They're very close." More days drifted on. More days of pain. More days of suffering in silence. They were forgettable and exhausting days. And deep down, I knew there would be even more of these days to come. A captain's meeting was called on the night of a full moon. We gathered around Coronado's tent and waited outside. Before Coronado appeared, the captains bantered with each other in commiserate and volleyed insults and sneers. They talked about their men. They talked about the paltry amounts of their rations. but mostly they talked about their doubt of the corazones, and looking at their faces, I saw again what I had seen in my men. I saw a collection of fear, doubt, and prevailing rage. They shouted on and on. I tried not to listen. These bastards won't tell us anything. What is there to tell? They're hiding something, I know it. These people are as poor as the land they stand on. What can they hide? This Marcos. I don't trust him anymore. I never did. This Marcos is a bastard. A real bastard. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know his asshole from his elbow. Didn't you see him cry like a child? He's wrong again. We'll hang him. We have no choice. A minute passed, then several more. The captains went on and on. I drifted out of sight. And in the darkness, I found Tovar. He was about 50 paces away from the fire. I approached him and shook his hand. Then he handed me a bottle of wine. You're too quiet, said Tovar. Speak, man. What about? I said. Do you believe in Marcos? No, I don't believe in him. I don't either. So why are we here? Your guess is as good as mine. But do you believe in the cities? Yes. Why, Sardina? Because I've seen them before. I've seen them in Peru. I've seen them in Mexico, said Tovar. We both seen shit others think are dreams. After he said this, he grabbed the bottle from my hand, uncorked it, and gulped it down in a long, hard swing. We're bound to find something, he finally said. A whole hour passed. It got to the point where the captain suggested voted on canceling the meeting. They grumbled and raised their hands, and just as they were ready to tally a vote, Coronado arrived. He dismounted off his horse and approached the fire. He still possessed the confident and arrogant presence, and he still walked that way too. He still looked like the Coronado of old, aloof, scrawny, and determined. But all the same, he remained young and too well-spoken for his own good. The man grew silent. He gave each of us a light scowl. Then the bastard spoke. I have assembled 12 captains. When we started, they all had different unique names. But now, they've all changed their name to Thomas. Doubt away, why don't you? Where is your patience, boys? Where has it gone? It died in the desert, sir, said Cardenas. Coronado turned his horse from side to side. Does Cardenas speak for you all? All nodded. Then Coronado asked each captain to stand forward and speak upon their collective grievances. 4 captains stated their reports, and after listening to them all, Coronado cradled his head in his hands and pulled his hair. Then when the 5th captain approached, Coronado interrupted. Enough! That's quite enough. Coronado stepped forward, and by his walk, I knew he was ready to give a speech of some kind. He held his sword out by his waist, then he spoke. He made it short and concise, and at the time, I commended him for doing so. I've heard all you have to say. I understand your grief. I've gathered you all here because I wanted to know. I wanted to be assured that this expedition is whole and that you are all committed. I want all of you to be assured that we will soon find these cities, and that we have not come all this way in vain. We have not! He waved the sword up high. Understand? The captain stood silent. In time, you'll laugh about this night. In time, we will endure. And by God in heaven, we will find them all. Coronado then dismissed the company and exited through the darkness. They were indeed his words, but they lacked conviction. Though Coronado believed in his words, we did not. His words felt empty. He was trying to lead. He was trying to be amiable and at the same time forceful. He was trying to mend the wounds and offer encouragement. But in trying all these things, he failed, and the men rolled their eyes in contempt. Then, In the darkness, I heard Coronado's voice again. Sardina, Cardenas, I want to see you both. We waited about a minute. Coronado remained in a daze. Cardenas. Yes, sir. Have you any idea of the Navy? They should be close. Make sure of it. Send your men 10 miles northwest, and once you see the river, make sure to rendezvous with Captain Diaz. If you don't see them in 5 days, report back immediately. Affirmative, sir. Cardenas saluted, then disappeared into the darkness. I waited until I stopped hearing his footsteps. Then I looked at Coronado. He was staring off again into the distance. His trance returned. There will be hell to pay. Sir? Coronado muttered to himself once more. I knew he didn't hear me. He groaned and growled. It sounded like he was breathing through his mouth. And he continued to stare that maddening, awful stare. He peered into the darkness and onto the waning, dingy moon. Yes, General, I said. You wanted to see me? Sardina! Yes, sir? I haven't seen you in a long time. He reached over to his chest and handed me a square piece of wood. It was a chessboard, and he tossed the sack up into the air. I caught it with my other hand. I looked inside the sack. I found 32 black and white stone pieces. Then Coronado smiled again and pointed to the fire. I think it's finally time, my friend. It was the last thing I wanted to do. I was exhausted. My eyes were weary and my feet felt numb. But it didn't matter. Coronado set up the board, and I followed him to the flame. I tended the dying fire while he set up the board. The board was polished with wax. It was too shiny, and the light that reflected off it blinded me. The pawns were uneven, but the rest of the pieces seemed to be carved meticulously with little wear. They seemed pristine, as if they were never touched. I doubted they ever were. I didn't know you played, I said. I have been practicing, said Coronado. With whom? This is Viceroy Mendoza's board. He let me borrow it. He said it would do me good to have. He taught you? Partially. Partially. I prefer to say I taught myself, he said in a pompous tone. For a second, I wanted to throw one of the pieces and smash his eyes. I thought of what Soto would do in that moment. He'd probably do exactly that. But I smirked and suffered the fool gladly. I kept quiet and studied the squares. The center four, the rows and columns, the diagonal across, the symmetry and the beauty, the cruelty, and the madness. Then Coronado held the black king and dangled it in between his thumb and index finger. Black? Black. Black it is, he said. I know it's been a long time since you played, Sardina. When was the last time? Do you remember? Was it with Soto? Probably was. I'll confess it's been a tremendous time since I last played. Perhaps back with the Viceroy for all I know. Let's see what I remember. One never forgets the rules, Governor. I hope I haven't, he said. I stared at him oddly. He expected me to smile. I tried, but it only lasted a second. I winced and clenched my teeth, and so we played. During the opening moves, I was surprised at Coronado's speed. He moved his pieces with precision and fitted them to each new square. But after the fifth move, his appeal had slipped and his control of the center had ceased. And I took full advantage. We stared at the board, watching all that was before us, and I could tell he was afraid. It was clear from the start that Coronado knew the rules and strategies, but he simply did not know when and how to apply them. And as the game went on, I knew Coronado had no general idea of what he was doing. In the matter of 4 more moves, I captured Coronado's king into a sufferable checkmate. He squirmed and bit his upper lip, and the games continued. We played for most of the night. I hadn't played the game in so long that I forgot how exhausting it was. But alas, most games are. The second game was quite impressive, but midway in, Coronado made a curious and ineffective move. And without reproach, I took his queen with a bishop. And 2 moves later, I cornered and mated his king. His play in the third game was dreadful, and the next games were more or less the same. He hadn't a tactic, and it scared me at first. He improvised and made some highly questionable moves with his rooks and pawns, but as time wore on, he became dreadfully predictable. He wasn't average, he was terrible, and the more games we played, the worse he got. I was glad to win at first. I took the wins in stride and felt glad that I had remembered so much about the game. But then I felt sad, for Coronado became no competition at all. At times, it felt embarrassing. His concentration dwindled, his frustration turned to apathy, and it felt at times that he simply forgot that he was playing. The night grew cold. Coronado paused. Then he dropped one of his pieces to the sand. "You play well, Sardina," he finally said. "Thank you, sir," I said. "Well, Sardina, I think I have taken enough beatings for one night. This game is clearly not for me." "That it's not, sir." I spent another hour with Coronado, and we talked about Soto and Spain. For all we knew, Soto was probably king already. From time to time, I heard his laugh echo in my mind. The thoughts led on and protruded their way down hollowed paths. Then, like the tide, the thoughts dissipated, and the sounds of the rustling winds and crickets replaced them. Coronado withdrew his eyes from the board. Then he yawned loudly. "I guess one could spend his entire life playing this game," he said. His face turned red. He scratched his forehead. Then he asked me a series of questions. He wasn't at all drunk, and that's what disturbed me the most. Our conversations weaved back and forth, and rambled. "What do you think angels sing about?" "I don't know." "Will you ever marry Sardina?" "I have no idea." "Tell me the truth, Sardina." "I am." "How are the men?" "The men are fine." "No, I mean the morale. How is their morale?" "Well, that's a different story." "Why?" "I believe they've been tested a little too much. This desert is starting to get the best of them. They're losing their faith. They need proof, that's all." "Proof?" "We need to find something soon, sir." "You needn't worry, Sardina. By week's end, we'll find all there is to see. Rest assured." "Tell me, Sardina, this Marcos, what do you make of him?" "He's a man of God." "Is that all he is?" "We can't all be Christ." "But what he saw, certainly he believes it. Certainly Brother Luis and the guides do as well." "Some have. Some continue to do so." He paused and yawned. "We will rendezvous with Alvarado and the Navy soon enough," he said. "Tell me, Sardina, one more thing. What do you call a man who spends his entire life staring at the face of God?" "A heretic?" "Yes, that's right. A heretic. I knew you'd get it. We need more of them in this world. God bless you, Sardina." I thought a long time about what he said. It didn't make the least bit of sense. And with that, I departed from the board in flame, and I was alone again. I watched Coronado from afar. He made it back to his tent, sat down, and wrote a letter. His face looked sad and old. He held a lock of his wife's hair and clutched it in his palms. Then he returned to his pen and wrote the night away. "My beloved Beatrice, forgive me for not writing you sooner. It has been 3 months since my last letter, but in my mind, I have written to you every day. I write because it feels as if it's the only refuge I have. I write at night, mainly because I don't want my men to be concerned, and since there is inadequate light to work with, I write very little. I love you dearly, Beatrice. As you know, when I write a letter, I take my time, for I want every word to count. And the truth of the matter is that lately my mind has been severely compromised. These days are long and unbecoming. They are endless and cruel. When you receive this letter, I would have done the following. I would have either found the cities, or I would have died trying. Whatever is the case, please know, dear, I love you. You and our children mean more than anything in my life. It saddens me that I'm so far away. Up until now, we still haven't found these golden cities, but our hopes still remain high, and the men's determination remains resolved, as does mine. To our credit, we continue to endure and embrace these empty days. We know there's much glory still to be found. Fray Marcos says Cibola is the first city we will reach. I myself have many doubts, but it will not deter me from searching this entire earth for these cities. Because I still dream the dream, as do my men. The dream is embedded in our eyes. But before I do, I must pass through this hell that lays before me. I must pass through this desert, this soulless void that's filled with pain and despair. Each man has his own devil and angel. I've seen my devil many times before. I see him every day, for this is his realm. Sand and stone, wind and damnation. It is an abyss that has no bottom, and that is this place in whole. My devil is ugly and cruel. He comes in many forms. Like he did to Christ, he rationalizes and points out facts, and every day he tempts me to go back to New Galicia. He tempts me to give it all up and reminds me that this expedition is all for naught, that I have been wasting my entire life chasing something that is simply not there. But I never listen to him. Instead, I let my angel guide me through, for she alone aids me in my quest. She alone knows the answer, and she alone guides me through all false promises and unworthy shortcomings. My angel guides me towards the light, and is the only reason I remain alive. And that is you, Beatrice. You are my angel. You are, and you always will be. I think of you every day. I know your spirit guides me on. For on the other side of this hell, a prosperous great heaven lies before us. It is a great heaven that our children and our children's children will inherit. These cities of gold are near, and it pains me that I'm not there already. As for now, I am still alive. I am still in search. My love for you defies all that is possible. And when I question myself why I do such an arduous task, why I continue to go on a mad pursuit, why I've committed myself and others to find this heaven in the desert, I remind myself of one simple reason. I do it for your smile. Your loving husband, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. In the days after we left the Corazones, it seemed our bad luck had followed us. We spent an entire week trying to rendezvous with Alvarado's navy, yet in all that time, we hadn't found one ship, nor any of Alvarado's men. It was a huge blow to the morale of my men and every man in the expedition. We waited another 2 days in vain and continued west. The terrain gradually became higher in elevation. We slogged through it at an incredibly slow and awful pace. I never believed in curses, but as we left the Corazones, it certainly felt as if some terrible aspersion was cast upon us. Leaving the Corazones when we did might have been the biggest blunder the expedition had ever made. But I knew the rationale. I knew how restless and bored each man was getting during their stay. The Corazones provided the food and rest we needed, but they didn't provide what we wanted. And as we left them, a certain air from our departure from Compostela had returned to me. I felt something in the vibrations of the horses and the men. It was the terrible sensation of hope. Coronado had simplified his search and combined each division into 3 units. 2 more days passed. I was informed by one of Coronado's scouts that my men were ordered to merge with another unit. He didn't tell me what captain it was going to be, and to my chagrin, Cardenas rode in behind me. I shook his hand and gave him a wry smile, but the smile was not returned. Cardenas was still as pompous and arrogant as ever. His glare, however, seemed compromised. His usual bloated face seemed tiny, and his words sounded soft and mechanical. With about 50 men now in collusion, we divided from Coronado and headed off to an agreed spot some 20 miles north of the canyons. We stopped for water near a steady cold stream a mile north. We filled all our canteens and buckets as we fed our horses and the few beasts of ox and sheep we had left. It took us a good hour to replenish each bucket and canteen before transferring them to their assigned caravan. As the horses pulled the excess weight, one of the wheels to the main caravan began to squeak and squabble. The weight proved too much to bear. The caravan had a quarter of a mile to go before it reached camp, and as the carriage came to a sharp bend, the weight transferred from back to front, and the spoke of the back wheel broke off. Shards of wooden splinters flew into the air, and seconds later, the entire caravan toppled over, and all the water we carried evaporated onto the sand. My men sighed. Cardenas's men just stared. I didn't even look at Cardenas. I didn't want to. I knew I had wasted enough time in my life, and I merely assisted the men back to the stream and replenished the canteens and buckets. Then I ordered the Diaz brothers to fix the carriage wheel. They assembled a makeshift wooden spoke and replaced the broken one. By the end of the afternoon, they had finished. We used 2 steers to replace the horses. The caravan wobbled and jerked, but it worked. As we reached sundown, we divided the water. I asked Cardenas for his own carriage to carry half of the load. Begrudgingly, he agreed, and I tried my hardest to keep my control and not stab him in his goddamn throat. When we left the stream that day, few knew that it would be another week before we would see any water of any kind. The land went on. There were no pueblos, nor any native in sight. The first 2 days, we rode north by northwest. Then we changed directions and headed due north. And the red, hot sun beat down. Cardenas kept to himself most of the time. Those men seemed amiable enough. After a while, I took a liking to them. They were very much like my men. They were poor and starved. Most of the time they talked to each other was at night, and to my surprise, there was very little contention with them or disdain. I suppose they were all too tired. At night, when I tried to sleep, a boy, not much older than 10 years old, played his guitar and kept me awake. Throughout the day, the boy walked, trekked, and followed, but at night, he played his guitar. He played beautiful, forgotten songs through the cold winds. His notes were long and sweet, and they brought tears to both the sentimental and the stoic among us. As his father lauded to me, the boy did most of his practice and achieved most of his money by playing near the entrances of whorehouses. "You gotta start somewhere," the father said to me. "Talented kid, isn't he?" And that he was. The boy's father was so proud of him, and if he were my boy, I would be too. One night, the boy played a song that I remembered hearing in Spain. It was a song that I once loved, though I never knew its title. It reminded me of my homeland. The song was beautiful, but something about it rang empty. It lacked chords and harmony. And as I took a deeper look, I noticed the boy's guitar only had 4 strings, and not all of them were in tune. But he played his best, and when the song ended, the men politely applauded and drifted off to sleep. But to me, those notes meant more. They haunted me. They hovered and lingered in my mind, and they tortured me for nights on end. When the sun came up the next day, we trekked again. The desert was void, and for hours at a time, we saw no living thing, not even a fly. Our pace slowed considerably. I watched the men inch through the sand. Their faces were red and tired. Each man shared similar scowls, and they suffered through many hours of joyless silence. I lost count of days that passed and asked Brother Luis the exact number. He figured it was 50 to 55 days since we left Compostela. In all that time, we found not a speck of any worthy metal. The more time that had passed, the more I noticed the many things we lost. We lost 3 horses. All of them had died from the heat. We lost sight of the red mountains, as all seemed to splurge into blinding blue, crisp skies. But the most important thing to disappear was water. The land was cracked. The earth was hard, and there was no water to be had at all. We had gone through most of our canteens. We only had our emergency supply left. The tiny streams that we took for granted all throughout the journey simply weren't there anymore. The desert did not allow them. The only water we could find were in the cacti plants, and if we hadn't found them, we would have all died. What remained were the hellish sand and sun. Both were yellow and crusted. Both were painful and cruel. And for days on end, that's all there was. Sun and sand. The real executioners, some had called them. They were well qualified, ever vigilant, and incredibly quiet. The sun killed us in ways no torturer could. Its method was slow and without pause. And the sands that we trekked through felt like pits of fire. Indeed, they were excellent executioners. They were exceptional. Our pace crawled. An hour's walk seemed impossible, but the desert wore on. We were right in the middle of it. It didn't care how long we suffered. It didn't care what we were searching for. It kept going. On towards infinity. More canyons appeared. They seemed deeper this time. They seemed unyielding. I shut my eyes to see if I was dreaming, but I couldn't tell anymore. I looked to Brother Luis. He kept in step, but clearly he was dazed and lost in his own contemplation. He mouthed some words and muttered to himself. They were most likely prayers of some sort. Periodically, I looked to see if my men were still alive. They were, albeit barely. Their faces were filthy, smeared with dirt and blisters. They stumbled and bobbed and weaved their weary heads forward, too exhausted to even think. Bernardo stumbled the most. He fell off his horse almost every day. I warned him not to drift and urged him to concentrate. But I might as well have talked to a statue. And when days ended, Bernardo accompanied his wife into the carriage, only to fall asleep in her lap. From the looks of it, she seemed used to it. For the next 3 days, I knew 2 things would eventually happen. We would either find the cities outright and conquer them quickly, or we would die in the desert and be forgotten for the rest of time. But for the meanwhile, we dreamt. I knew this feeling very well. Every man was caught in his own trance, lost, and seemingly gone forever. Damned and true. I'd felt it before in Peru. It was exactly the same feeling. The men were lost in a collective dream. And just like in Peru, the men closed their eyes and drifted onward, through endless, awful shadows. In each trance, each man saw different things. Some saw pearls and rubies. Some saw flashes and strikes of light. Some saw single golden bars. Others saw a version of Cusco that dwarfed Egypt and Rome combined. And still, others saw the city streets and met glimmering ghastly gods who spoke in tongues and crowned them kings. I certainly saw those things. I certainly remembered. For a brief moment, I saw my younger self. I saw myself in wonder as I stared at Atahualpa in the flesh. I saw myself stare onto Atahualpa's gaudy bat-skin cloak, marveling at his golden necklace that draped along his shoulder. And throughout the next 3 days, the trances came in and out like the tides of the ocean. They were predictable and all too common. I slipped deep into one trance during the early morning as I rode on my horse. And even on foot, the trance continued without interruption. What was strange, though, was that the trance continued throughout the entire day. and there were moments where I found myself completely alone. Then Julio approached me. His hand shook. He looked into the distance.
Sir, please tell me.
Tell you what?
The truth.
The truth?
Please.
What is it, Julio?
Are we
what?
Are we
lost? The Spanish stand still as statues. And in the thunder, the Turk laughs at the Spanish and enters into their minds. A cry of a wolf, rolls of thunder. The night proceeds. The Turk wears an antelope skull on his head. He dances in rhythm. He kneels with his hands outstretched. Then he shouts and squeals and appears in shadows. It starts to rain. Some of the Spanish see him. Some of the Spanish believe what they see. Some do not.
El Diablo!
They shout.
It's the devil! Can't you see?
The Turk appears closer. He bends time. Torches exhaust in the rain. Moans of women fill the air, some of horrors, some of mothers. The visions appear. Cibola, the great city in all its glory. And in the trails of smoke, the visions swirl and flashes.
The cities! Look! Cibola! Cibola!
They slip deeper. They scream and holler. They cry and shake.
I saw the city! I swear to God I did!
Where?
I saw them too!
Satan.
I swear I saw him, I swear!
How can you be sure?
His face was red. It was real, I tell you, real! I felt it! I felt his breath! The devil, I say! I saw 3 heads and 8 eyes! And claws! My God, those horrible claws! It has to be the devil! There's no other explanation!
And the Turk grins, watching them from high up top the hill. We were lost. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. If someone said it was a year, I wouldn't have believed it. But we were lost. My trance continued. I saw 2 suns rise and set upon opposite ends. I found myself on a green, lush hill. Later, I heard church bells. They rang and they rang. But the town was empty. It wasn't Compostela, nor Galicia. It wasn't even Trujillo, my own rotten home. I was in an abandoned city with no name. I went about and searched through each and every home, but I found not a soul. The bells kept ringing. I felt my heart stop. I pressed my hand over it, but I couldn't feel my pulse. And the bells kept ringing. They bellowed and cried. Someone had died. They rang for another hour, perhaps more. Then they stopped. I turned and the town disappeared among the rolling swirls of dust and sand. I found a cup of wine in the sand. Inside was a small scorpion. It stung my finger, and my blood dripped and gushed down the sand. I smashed the scorpion with my hand and stomped on it with my boot. A black and green pile of pus remained, and I spat on it and drank the wine. The trance continued. I walked down the hills, which suddenly turned into long corridors. And from within the chambers, I heard screams and saw a great grand table. The bloody heads of all the Pizarros had been laid upon each silver plate, and all of them had murmured and waited for their feast to arrive. But then I awoke. I looked down from my horse and saw the robes of a monk. Dreaming again, Sardina?
Yes. Yes, Luis. I suppose so, I said.
There's no fault in that, he said. An hour passed. We were seeing things as if we dreamt the same dreams. The men couldn't help themselves. They muttered to themselves incoherently.
I saw something. I know I did. Marcos is right. The cities are near. I saw them. We're close. We're finally close.
Coronado's unit finally joined us in the afternoon, and in an hour the entire army returned in whole. All of the men shouted in glee. They too saw the same things we had, the same visions and reveries, and they too could not utter a word without sounding like a fool. We had finally reached Cibola. We had beaten the desert itself. But the Turks' plan did not work. The Spanish took the dreams and nightmares not as a warning, but rather as proof that the cities were near. Throughout the long and hot day, the men dreamed on. But instead of retreating, the Spanish moved even closer to Cibola. And indeed nothing, not even Satan himself, could have stopped them. Marco shouted for a full minute. I saw him break into full stride and watched him climb up heavy rocks. Then I saw him trip on the bottom of his robe. He fell flat on his face. His shouts came muted. They continued from 1/8 of a mile across the ridge. Then he yelled once more.
Great Cibola! Great Cibola! Great God in heaven, it's here! It's here! The cities! We're here!
Across the ridge, I saw Coronado. He rode erect and gallantly. 2 scouts rushed forward. I stayed by Coronado's side, studied his grim face, and waited for him to say a word. Marco stood like Moses on the ridge. And as we headed towards him, we saw the lowland of the valley and the sets of pueblos beyond it. And although Cibola was finally in sight, it still seemed so far away. Great Cibola. It was 2 miles away from the downslope of the hill, and it was smaller than the Spanish had imagined. Coronado approached Marcos. They prayed for an hour. They prayed all the prayers they knew, both New Testament and Old. They muttered and paced, slurred, and invented new words and phrases. They held each other's hands. They lost their place many times, but they stammered through. Then Jesus spoke unto Satan and said, Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angels and delivered his servants, who trusted in he. Then they said a final prayer, both of which they knew by heart. It was the lesson of the fig tree, which they recited in unison. Then Jesus spoke, Learn from the fig tree. When its branches become tender and it sprout leaves, you know summer is here. In the same way, when you see all these things, know that he is near at the gates. Amen, I say to you, this generation will not pass until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not.